It began with a silence that did not belong to France in June 1944. The crash of guns from Normandy still rolled like weather along the western horizon, yet deep in the forests of the Vienne the air grew still, as if the countryside itself were bracing for something that would not be seen, only later discovered in clues, wreckage, and graves. The order came down on June 24. Detachments of the British Special Air Service were to infiltrate central France under the codename Operation Bulbasket. Their brief was not to ambush columns or raid depots, but to remove from the war a single critical hinge. Luftwaffe night bombers staging from interior French airfields to strike Allied shipping off the Normandy bridgehead. If those bombers kept flying, fuel lines and troop buildup across the beaches could be choked. If they were silenced, the amphibious gamble might breathe long enough to deepen its hold. The task looked suicidal on paper. The SAS would insert in dribs and drabs by Stirling and Halifax within occupied territory still thick with German rear echelons. They would wear civilian clothes or mixed dress for ease of concealment, though this placed them under the shadow of Hitler's commando order. Capture without uniform meant no Geneva rights, only interrogation and execution. Their radios would have to be husband. Batteries were life. Their food would come from fields and from people who could be shot for handing over a loaf. The pain was immediate and invisible, the kind peculiar to clandestine war. To reach the target belt around Poitiers, Châtellerault, Saumur, the SAS moved by night through lanes where every bicycle crunch, every dog bark, and every opening of a barn hinge could carry to German ears. Men learned to breathe with their teeth touching, to urinate in cloth, to ban silence only with decisive gunfire or not at all. In the first week ashore, one corporal wrote in a tiny hand on torn cigarette paper, "Hard to believe a man can die from restraint, but that is the fear working on us, to do nothing until it must be done." Part of the torment was time dislocation. They were action troops condemned to days of motionless waiting so that when they finally struck, it would count. The Luftwaffe fields were alive. Ju-88s and He-111s cycling in from Germany, refueling, loading, and streaking back west against the Channel. To attack too early would only punish the periphery. To attack once with patience might break the spine of the sortie rhythm. A senior SAS note later declassified put it dryly, "Opportunity and annihilation share the same envelope, open it early and you get neither." A hard historical lesson, discovered and rediscovered in every irregular war since, hangs in that line. Precision does not coexist with hurry. You pay for decisive effect with days of discomfort, exposure, and a level of personal risk that cannot be insured. Modern doctrine in US and UK special operations still cites Bulbasket terror discipline when teaching delay to multiply effect. Yet none of these men knew how the math would close. They only knew that the German rear area was tightening since Normandy. Every day of waiting risked betrayal by informers, accidental encounter, or radio intercept. French civilians watched hedgerows with unreadable faces, some friendly, some afraid, some living under threats the SAS could not see. In later interviews, one farmer said simply, "The war moved into our walls, but we did not know on which side." By the end of June, the infiltrated detachments had linked with elements of the local Maquis and cached their weapons and demolition stores in the woods near Poitiers. The airfields were now within reach. They had eyes on fuel bozers, aircraft parks, and crew quarters. They also had the noose around them, German field police sweeping roads, the Gestapo sniffing for partisans, and Vichy auxiliaries narrowing the air men could breathe. Nothing had exploded yet. No shot announced that the SAS were present. But France could feel them. One village woman, interviewed 40 years after the war, recalled the sensation with eerie simplicity. The noise of the world dropped, as if someone had entered the house and not closed the door. The strike decision, when, where, and in what weight, lay just ahead. So did the counterstroke that would decide who among the raiders would live long enough to report success, and who would vanish into the unmarked ground that still confounds the record. By the first week of July 1944, the woods near Poitiers were alive with whispers of the unseen. British SAS teams of 1st and 2nd Squadron, operating under Major John Tonkin, had joined forces with the local Marquis du Poitou. The men slept in haylofts and thickets, living off the land and what few rations had been parachuted in at night. Their purpose remained razor-thin: cripple the Luftwaffe airfields feeding the front. Yet every passing convoy on the N10 road reminded them how deep they were inside the German belly. The problem was not courage. It was movement. Dressed in French civilian clothes or mixed battle dress, they carried Sten guns, Brents, and a handful of Lewis bombs for sabotage. They were ghosts without uniforms, protected by no convention, answerable to no flag if captured. Hitler's Kommandobefehl, the 1942 Commando Order, made that brutally clear. Allied commandos caught behind lines were to be executed immediately, even if in uniform. The men of Operation Bulbasket had read it before departure. One trooper joked grimly that our uniforms are our death warrants either way. The forest became both sanctuary and cage. Every track had to be watched, every light extinguished before dusk. The Germans were nervous, and their Feldgendarmerie patrols had grown more aggressive since reports of parachutists in the area. The Marquis warned the SAS that the Gestapo had begun raiding farmsteads and arresting entire families. "We are hunted together now," one French partisan told Tonkin. "We must move like smoke." Even so, the alliance was uneasy. The Marquis, many barely trained, favored hit-and-run attacks, burning trains, ambushing convoys, while Tonkin's orders demanded patience for a single decisive blow. Food was scarce. Spirits volatile. A captured German ration truck yielded tins of coffee and black bread, but also led to increased patrols. By mid-July, the SAS counted nearly 5,000 enemy troops searching an area they occupied with fewer than 40 men. In his field diary, Lieutenant Peter O'Callaghan noted the tension in clipped understatement. "We hear convoys all night, engines idling like breathing animals. Movement limited to darkness. Morale strained. Fear not of death, but of waste, that it come before the strike." His handwriting deteriorated toward the end, the script jagged, perhaps from riding on a weapon or from hunger. Despite the danger, their reconnaissance deepened. Châtellerault Airfield, a Luftwaffe base hosting Junkers Ju-88 bombers and fuel depots, was confirmed as the main target. Its runways were close to the main rail line from Tours, making it a crucial node for both air and ground logistics. Through binoculars and the whispered help of French rail workers, the SAS observed refueling patterns and identified aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, a demolition man's dream, if one could survive long enough to set the charges. The pain and strain of concealment turned into something more psychological. SAS operators were trained for action, yet now they were gardeners of silence, pruning tracks, burying ration tins, and waiting for coded radio signals that sometimes failed to come. Batteries weakened in the damp heat. One operator had to walk 12 miles to catch a signal burst from London. When a parachute drop went wrong, scattering containers across a field, the men knew recovery might expose them all. "Even the cows could betray us," one survivor later joked, "if they mooed at the wrong time." The line between soldier and fugitive blurred. Some men grew bearded, their faces blackened with soot for night movement. Others, in a strange kind of gallows humor, adopted false civilian names: Jean, Pierre, the milkman. The disguise that protected them by day also stripped them of identity. If they died, they would die as ghosts, unrecorded and unrecognizable. A post-war file found in Q contains a single line about this period: disguised units operating in VN sector, high efficiency, zero visibility. There was wisdom in that invisibility, a principle that echoes through modern special operations. The less the enemy sees, the longer the effect lasts. Yet the same invisibility also made them vulnerable. If killed or captured, no uniform, no badge, and no known location would testify they ever existed. The line between operational secrecy and historical erasure had already begun to blur. By the second week of July, intelligence reports confirmed the Luftwaffe's pattern. Fuel trucks arrived each night from the east, parked in open revetments, and refueled bombers before dawn. That vulnerability, liquid fire sitting under moonlight, was the key the SAS had waited for. Tonkin began to plan the assault. As the men checked detonators and packed their final Lewis bombs, the forest around Poitiers was tense with anticipation. Farmers noted strangers moving before dawn, whispers in the hedgerows, and once, the distant hum of an aircraft that dropped nothing they could see. One Maquis courier later remembered, "They came like shadows and vanished the same way. We didn't know if we had seen Englishmen or ghosts." The strike was set for the next night, the airfield at Châtellerault, the heart of the Luftwaffe's reach in western France. No one among them could have guessed that the attack itself would succeed brilliantly, and yet mark the beginning of the end for most who took part. The night chosen for the attack on Châtellerault Airfield was close and heavy, the kind of darkness that drinks sound. The SAS reconnaissance had been meticulous. Bombers were parked in tight ranks, fuel bozers and bomb stockpiles sat unprotected, and guard rotations were predictable. The conditions were perfect by the cruel arithmetic of sabotage. Everything flammable, compressible, and vulnerable was in one place. If they struck once, cleanly, the Luftwaffe's reach toward Normandy would buckle. The raiding group moved out in small packets, each man carrying only what he would need. Lewis bombs packed with plastic explosive and thermite for fuel trucks, Sten guns with 2 or 3 magazines, not 6, grenades only for break contact, not for noise. They traveled on rural lanes and through cuttings in the hedgerows, the Maquis guiding them to within a few hundred yards of the perimeter. A final check confirmed the runway lights were out and the night orderly officer had gone inside. One raider whispered, "We could be walking across a map." There was no margin for improvisation. The attack had to be fast and final. If they lingered, they would be buried where they fell. The nearest German barracks lay just minutes away by truck. The order was simple: strike fuel first, aircraft second, and leave nothing unexploded. One SAS demolition NCO later wrote in a private note, "We cannot kill their air arm, but we can kill their ability to put fire in the air." It was a precise understanding of effect, not to destroy the Luftwaffe in France, but to remove its hands from the throat of Normandy. The first charges went on to the fuel bowers, soft targets with catastrophic consequences. Men worked in pairs, looping adhesive pads to the tanks and setting pencil fuses cut for staggered delay. Others crossed to the bomber line, packing charges beneath Ju-88 wing roots and wheel struts, where blast would both collapse the aircraft and ignite residual fuel. Every second spent inside the wire multiplied the risk of discovery, but the raiders traded time for geometry, the careful spacing of explosions to cascade ignition across the field. A British sergeant at the scene, riding weeks later in a hospital bed, described the moment before withdrawal. "Everything was quiet as a man inside a grave. We could feel the whole field waiting to become fire." It is a sentence that has been quoted in SOE and SAS training for decades, the definition of controlled violence. Then the night came apart. The first fuel truck detonated with a thunderous concussion, throwing a column of fire that lit the airfield like a funeral pyre. The secondary blasts followed in rolling succession, bozers, then bomb stacks, then the aircraft themselves, each one a multiplier. A flaming Junkers collapsed over its own wing, showering burning metal across 2 neighbors. Ammunition cooked off in shrieking arcs. The airfield became a self-feeding detonation. The raiders did not linger to watch. They were already running into the tree line, machine pistols ready only if cornered. German searchlights clawed the sky too late. The guard huts spilled men who could not even hear their own orders over the explosions. One Maquis guide said afterward, "It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the attackers before the flame reached our eyes." By dawn, the damage was total: aircraft destroyed, fuel burned, crews killed in blast or smoke. Luftwaffe logs recovered after the war show abrupt interruption of missions from Châtellerault in the days following. Allied intelligence concluded the pressure on Normandy's shipping slackened noticeably, the intent of Bulbasket fulfilled. But the tactical success birthed a new danger. The German reaction was immediate and severe. Roads were sealed, villages searched, and rail halts patrolled. Wehrmacht units, Feldgendarmerie, and Sicherheitsdienst, SD detachments began systematic sweeps. Intercepts suggest Berlin believed a major Allied force had infiltrated the interior. Entire districts were now treated as hostile. For the SAS, the trap was tightening. Every farmhouse they had used was now suspect. Curfews were enforced with weapons drawn. Civilians who had handed them milk or maps were at mortal risk. A French priest later told investigators, "After the fire at the airfield, we knew the answer would be paid in blood, we just did not know whose." The men of Bulbasket withdrew deeper into the woods to break contact, splitting into smaller elements to avoid encirclement. But radio traffic was thin, batteries failing, and drop zones compromised. They had delivered their blow. Now they lived on borrowed hours. Somewhere in those woods, even as the smoke still rose from the airfield, the decision was already forming among the German command. Find them, and make an example. Files would later show orders for immediate execution of captured raiders had been prepared before a single man was in German hands. The strike had worked. The price had only begun to fall. Hook. The morning after the flames, the countryside smelled of burning fuel and a different, harder scent. Fear. What had been a surgical strike against an airfield on a single night had turned the Vienne woods into an incendiary spotlight. German command perceived not only damage but insolence, and their response was swift and brutal. Content reference, Oversight, 0, index equals 0 pain/struggle. Within hours of the Châtellerault conflagration, roadblocks closed like clamps across the region. Wehrmacht units, Feld gendarmerie patrols and SD detachments converged on known drop zones and suspected hideouts. The rails were torn up and every lane examined. The SAS and their Marquis allies, who had expected pursuit, now found the countryside rearranged against them. Caches and jeeps that had been lifelines vanished as farmers and couriers were rounded up and interrogated. Commanders who had planned for speed and stealth now watched in helplessness as whole villages were sealed and innocent people were hauled away for questioning. Intelligence later showed the Germans believed a large Allied force had penetrated deep behind their lines and treated the area accordingly, with systematic, ruthless measures. Content reference, Oversight. 1, index equals 1 wisdom/historical insight. In that pressure cooker, simple operational vulnerabilities became mortal hazards. The capture of the SAS base near Verrières, the consequence of betrayal, compromised communications, or sheer bad luck still debated by historians, meant the raiders' protective invisibility collapsed into exposure. Contemporary accounts and post-war examinations record a grim cascade: 33 SAS men, a downed Yuzov pilot, and several Maquisards were taken in the follow-up assault on the camp. Many were executed in the woods or in custody. That brutal arithmetic, that covert success can transform into overt catastrophe when your sanctuary is revealed, became a harsh lesson for special operations thereafter. Content reference, Oversight. 2, index equals 2, reveal/modern relevance. The manner of the German response and the subsequent executions were not simply punitive, they were political messaging. The Nazi chain of command intended to deter further resistance by making an example of captured commandos and partisans. For modern viewers, the lesson is stark. The security of irregular operations depends not only on technique but on the political context in which they take place. Rules of engagement, protections for non-combatants, and the legal status of operatives matter enormously, and when they are stripped away, human costs can multiply. Content reference, Oversight. 3, index equals 3 the application/takeaway. Operational planners today study Bulbasket as a case study in ends and means. Tactical brilliance can be undone by strategic overreach or by failure to anticipate enemy policy toward captured fighters. The discipline shown in the raid, careful target selection, coordinated demolition, and rapid withdrawal, achieved a clear Allied effect. But the following collapse of safe havens demonstrates that success in sabotage must be paired with contingency plans for extraction, political mitigation, and the protection of civilians. Those are not dry lessons. They are the thin lines between mission success and local catastrophe. Content reference, Oversight. 4, index equals 4, close/emotional wrap-up. The accounts of survivors and witness statements carry the human cost in stark detail. Prisoners led into the trees, the echo of boots on leaves, the silence after shots stopped, graves dug in haste. Some wounded men taken to local hospitals were later murdered in their beds. Marquis families who had helped the raiders paid with arrests, deportations, or death. Post-war inquiries pieced together fragments: a soldier's scrawled note, a priest's testimony, a German transport log, but key details remained stubbornly elusive. Who betrayed the camp, when exactly the orders for execution were signed, which local collaborators drove the sweeps. The lack of single, clean answers hardened into a different kind of ache, a gap in the record where names and fates should have been. Content reference, WWII. 5. Index equals 5. The echoes of that day would not stop with immediate reprisals. RAF and Allied commands reacted in the weeks that followed, mounting strikes against German positions and attempting to blunt the blow Bulbasket had drawn out of the woods. Yet for the men who had fought in hedgerows and who disappeared into unmarked earth, no after-action report could fully account for the loss. The field notebooks, telegrams, and a few survivors' memories became the thin paper trail historians would later follow, a trail that leads to graves, to contested testimony, and to names still debated. The strike had achieved its aim tactically, but it had also set in motion a chain of retribution that left unanswered questions, and families waiting for closure for decades to come. Content reference, WWII. 6. Index equals 6. The destruction at Châtellerault achieved exactly what London had hoped. Luftwaffe pressure on Normandy slackened, but for the men who lit those charges, success was the start of a different clock. German sweeps no longer probed, they harvested. Lanes were barred by sandbag points, hedgerows searched with bayonets, farmhouses entered without knocking. The SAS, cut into smaller packets to avoid a single encirclement, now moved like refugees rather than raiders. The dragnet worked. A Bulbasket camp near Verrières, cold-soaked tired, short of battery power, exposed by some combination of talk, track sign, or betrayal, was overrun. Most of the SAS captured there were held only long enough to be identified as commandos, then shot. Some Marquis were executed in the same hours. The commando order, once an abstraction signed in Berlin, now lived in the tree lines of Vienne as an unarguable fact. And the killing did not stop at the wood edge. Wounded prisoners moved to hospitals were removed later and shot. Others were buried in shallow pits without names or markers. Decades afterward, exhumations produced bones with no surviving paperwork to anchor them to a man or squad. In one post-war interview, a French priest, who had heard the single shots spaced by minutes, said simply, "They died in order, as if someone were crossing out a list." The strategic lesson was brutal and permanent. Irregular success attracts regular wrath. A raid may be clean, but the aftermath will not be, and the aftershock will land on those who cannot shoot back. Civilians, couriers, hosts, families. Modern doctrine on clandestine action cites Bulbasket as a case in the cost of operating without an exfil plan or political shield. A mission may be perfect tactically and still incur irrecoverable loss once it is over. For the men still loose in the woods, the math reversed. Mobility mattered more than fire. They shed weight, burned maps, split into pairs, and tried to ghost their way out of a landscape whose every ditch was now a listening post. The paradox deepened. The lighter they became, the less they could record. The less they recorded, the more their traces would fade. The work that had been invisible by design now threatened to become invisible in memory. By the time Allied lines advanced into the region weeks later, the outcome of the strike was secure, but the roster of the men who made it so was not. Files were missing, tags not worn, bodies moved, civilian witnesses displaced or dead. When families asked in London how their sons died, the answers shrank to fragments: killed behind the lines, not recovered, believed executed. Between those clean phrases lay a void large enough to swallow a chapter of the war complete. And in that void sat the enduring mystery that would animate the next decades of inquiry. Not whether Bulbasket succeeded, but how many of the hands that made it succeed vanished from the record without a line, a date, or a grave to fix their names to earth. When the guns fell silent and France was liberated, the work of reckoning did not begin with triumph. It began with absences. Families in Britain wrote for details and received formulas: missing, presumed killed, believed executed. The Airfield strike itself was well documented. The fates of many of the men who carried it out were not. Inquiries opened in the late 1940s turned up bone, metal, and rumor, but not the linear narrative grief needs. Post-war exhumations near Verrières and in the woods around Poitiers located remains in irregular pits. Some were tied with wire. Some still wore fragments of civilian cloth. Others could be identified only by a heel plate, a dental pattern, or nothing at all. German field files taken as war booty offered partial confirmation. orders invoking Hitler's commando order, arrest logs without dispositions, witness notes stripped of names. What they did not show was the critical hinge. Who signed the actual death orders and on what date? Historians who reopened Bulbasket in the 1980s and 1990s ran into the same wall. French prefecture archives held signed statements from farmers and clergy, single shots, trucks at night, hasty burials, but no clear chain from capture to execution command. German surviving personnel disagreed in interview. Some blamed the SD, others the Wehrmacht police, still others implied an ad hoc decision under reprisal doctrine. The paper record is not only thin, it is cross-cancelling. And there was a second void: betrayal. Was the camp revealed by a paid informant, by an intercepted wireless, by chance during an anti-Marquis sweep, or by a coerced civilian under torture? Competing claims survive. None close the case. In special operations training today, the Bulbasket file is used not merely as a tactical exemplar but as a caution about epistemic limits. Even successful raids can exit history as missed, leaving arguments in place of answers. Memory work tried to repair what the archive could not. British and French commissions erected stones with names. Later DNA attempts matched a handful of remains to known men. But several of the executed still lie under headstones marked only known unto God, and at least one Marquis family line never learned whether their missing sons died in the same pits as the SAS. The ledger of sacrifice is legible in effect, not in detail. The enduring relevance is uncomfortable but adult. Some parts of war do not resolve, some files never close, some debts are paid by people who never saw the order that spent them. Bulbasket remains in doctrine because it succeeded militarily and because it exposes the permanent seam in irregular war, between what can be done decisively in the field and what can be documented, named, and mourned afterward. Thus the strike that silenced a Luftwaffe airfield continues to echo, not only in the operational manuals that cite its economy of force, but in the unfilled lines on casualty rolls and the unanswerable questions in family letters. The explosives did their work in a single night. The uncertainties they left have outlived every man who lit the fuses.